This video is somewhat of an experiment. It's not a video that I needed to make for any of my classes, although it will fit in probably nicely with the planar structure discussion that we're going to be engaging in any drawing class that I teach. I'm going to make sure that that topic gets discussed. And so when we start talking about planes, I'm going to try to get into some detail using this drawing as an excuse. But in the meantime, I'm just doing some measuring, and it'll become clear what the subject matter is as the drawing progresses. But I'm just doing some measuring here, and I can't really engage too much in the idea that I have until I get the basic proportions and stuff right. And I have a tendency when I'm drawing faces to elongate the face, especially around the middle of the face. So I thought if I took the Socrates sculpture and laid him on the table, I would remove some of my biases regarding that proportion problem that I tend to have. So, and it turns out that I stretched him a little bit, but it wasn't quite as bad as usual. But what I wanted to do with this drawing was to make an attempt to render form without relying on the traditional thoughts that you're supposed to be having about shading, not relying on core shadows and cast shadows. And so I use Michelangelo as my inspiration for that. And if we take a break from my drawing and take a look at the Michelangelo's study for the Libyan Sibyl, which is a part of the Sistine Chapel ceiling. It's a drawing that Michelangelo makes that I've looked at for a long time, and it's just one of my favorite drawings. And I've been looking at this drawing for years, and a while back, after having looked at it for a long time, I noticed that in the drawing, there seems to be a light source, but there are no shadows. Like, to speak, there's no cast shadows to speak of. I mean, her head kind of casts a shadow on her neck, but that's it. And if you look at the arm is in the dark in a way that the back is not. So I was really kind of questioning. I was like, well, why is this such a great drawing if it's so inconsistent the way it's lit? And it occurred to me that it's important to know about Michelangelo is that he was a sculptor first. He was a draftsman, he was a painter, he was an architect, but first he was a sculptor. And when a sculptor is drawing and just like sort of thinking visually, thinking out loud visually, they're not really concerned with making an image where the way a painter would be. And of course, this is a study for a painting, so this not 100% applies. But the idea that Michelangelo is thinking out loud with this drawing, thinking about how this body is drawn in 3 dimensions, it puts a different set of priorities on the way that he builds form, because he's not really worried about the light source being from one direction. So it makes it a very strange drawing when you start looking at it that way. So what I wanted to do with the drawing of Socrates here, and I have a whole bunch of other drawings where I attempt to do the same thing, but this will be, a recording of the process instead of just the result. What I wanted to do was really focus on the planar structure of the drawing, and without relying on shadows which I totally saw because I lit the still life in a way that was pretty traditional for a still life. I just kept the contrast low so that I could see what was in front of me. And you do see me doing a little shading here, but mostly it's so that I can tell the difference between one plane and another. What I'll do in the drawing is I'll tend to alternate planes with a value. So I went into the drawing intending not to do any shading in at all, and just let the process build the surface and the values of the drawing up. But I started to realize pretty early that I was going to lose a lot of the information I was going to lose. So I had to insert some of those values. And it's just a logical thing. And I'm trying not to dwell on it, but I'm talking about it, so I'm dwelling on it a little bit. But at this point in the drawing, it's pretty well developed. So why don't I talk about planar structure a little bit? So the idea behind planar structure is that if you're trying to render an object, it's always going to be an object in space. And so the planes are going to be the flat areas on it. And you can have an otherwise round object, like the forehead or some of the curls or his mustache, let's say, in this drawing. You can have an otherwise round object that has flat areas that are punctuated by curved areas, so that you end up with a combination of flat areas and transitions. And what I'm trying to do in the drawing is isolate the difference between, like if I take a mass like the nose, and my concern is helping the viewer to understand how the nose functions in space, so how it takes up space, but also how it moves away from us, from our particular point of view, our station point. So to try and simplify that in terms of discussing it, is the front of the nose, which would be the front under normal circumstances. Here it's the top. So the very top plane of the nose is pretty flat and simple, and it runs along the top. And then, but the side of the nose, which is the front to us in this scenario, they just, it's kind of like a cube. You have the top of the cube and then you have the front plane. But then things get way more complex because the side of a nose is not just a single plane. We might refer to that as like the big plane for the side of the nose is the primary plane. But then inside it has smaller planes that articulate its sort of directions. And in the side of the nose here, you can kind of see, I have it broken up into, from left to right, it looks like 4 or 5, 6, 7, 8 different planes, and that doesn't even include the nostrils or anything else. So that's what the basic thinking is about. Like if we're structuring our planes, we're establishing primary planes first, and primary planes are usually it's the big 3 planes on a mass that you can really see. So again, with the nose, there's the top and there's the front, and then the nostril part would be the side. And then if you have another part, if you're thinking about the mustache, it gets a little bit more complicated than that. But the mustache has a top, and then it has a side on the left and a side on the right. And so once we get that big information in, then we can start worrying about the smaller information. And that's what you can see me doing in the drawing now. I'm just going around and trying to think about each part and just plug a little bit more information every time I make a pass at a certain passage. Now, the last thing that I want to do in this discussion is get ahead of myself. And And I think I may have gotten ahead of myself a little bit in getting into too much detail on the secondary plane stuff. So I want to close out the discussion by um, stressing the importance of uh, like the the idea that the biggest planes are the ones that dictate the most important information. So talking about if we're only talking about the nose, we're sort of excluding the the rest of the mass and the structure. And like a head like this is a series of masses that work together to build a single form. Um, so it would probably be important to point out that just in terms of thinking about it and structurally, the mass itself, like the face, is the top. And then if we look at like the eyebrow and below that, like where the face sort of turns into like there's the front of the face and then there's the cheek. There's a big plane that runs down the whole thing that we could call cheek. And then there's some hair and beard that kind of comes forward. And then there's another area that drops down. Those things are way more important ultimately than the secondary planes and the details that I'm going into in the drawing. But at the beginning of the drawing, I worked out where those things were going to be. So I didn't even occur to me to talk about it until 10 minutes in. So I just want to stress that when you're drawing and you're trying to make the stuff work, it's important not to skip any steps. When you're drawing, you want to establish the location of the important things first. Then you want to establish your primary planes, the biggest ones there are. And then, so that would be the big planes of the face. And then the nose has its own planes. So I suppose there are primary planes for the mass, and then there are primary planes for the details. Another way to think about the difference between primary planes on a big scale and primary planes on a small scale is that if you think about a cube has a top and a front and it's in a side, and it's really easy to see the difference there. If the Socrates sculpture is a cube, the face is its top, the side of the head and the cheek are its front, and then we can take a Mr. Potato Head nose and glue it on there and then render that.